So next, we will move into our panel discussions. These panels will focus on how emerging technologies can support funders and help underserved communities access essential services. I invite Mr. Vinod Rajasekaran to introduce the panelists for both sessions. Nous allons maintenant passer à nos discussions de panel. Ces panels aborderont la manière dont les technologies émergentes peuvent soutenir les bailleurs de fonds et aider les communautés mal desservies à accéder aux services essentiels. J'invite M. Vinod Rajasekaran à introduire les panélistes pour ces deux sessions. Merci.
Super. Let's, right? Okay, good morning. This is we've got sort of like a cheer going on here. What an incredible conference so far, and certainly an incredible opening keynote from Ileana. And it's been really, really interesting to be here and explore the intersection between technological progress and social progress. And that's one of the really unique things I think about this experience. And this conversation is with funders on how emerging technologies, especially technologies like AI, can help funders better accomplish their missions and support underserved communities. So my name is Vinod Rajasekaran. I'm the CEO of Future of Good. And Future of Good is a leading media, learning, and research organization that equips social purpose leaders and teams with insights and knowledge through innovative journalism, conferences, and research. And at Future of Good, emerging technologies such as AI is an important part of our focus and our work. Our technology journalist, Charlene Gandhi, is here with us at the conference, and she spends a lot of her time learning, engaging, highlighting how technologies are shaping social purpose organizations and how technological solutions are gaining traction and how they are bettering communities and bettering community services. You know, we've heard a lot yesterday and even this morning about the state of play, and so much is changing so fast. And this is affecting all kinds of workplaces and communities and neighborhoods. There's one particular study that I'll highlight from yesterday, and that's from Harvard, where it indicated that there is systemic gender and racial bias in some of the world's leading Gen AI tools. And I want us all to sort of think about that for a second, where systemic bias in the leading AI tools, right? And this is in healthcare and social services, in HR and recruitment, policing, and so much more, where AI tools are deciding, who is risky, who is at risk, right? They're deciding, are you human? Are you not human, right? They're deciding who should be screened in, who should be eligible for something, right? So, but yet again, as Ileana pointed out, there's a tremendous potential of AI for addressing racism, for building collective awareness, for strengthening belonging, for mobilizing and educating, for shaping better public policy, for supporting families and neighborhoods, and so much more. And Ileana shared a number of examples of how AI, can help us live better lives. And so I want to get into, a question and an exploration, as she put, around what is the opportunity for funders in this space. For my perspective, one of the big opportunities is to support community organizations in leveraging AI tools to make our services better, right? And there's so much more that funders could use AI for. So I certainly feel, based on all of the conversation yesterday, this is a very timely conversation, and it's the first time I think we're exploring the role of funders in this space. So we have a couple of wonderful speakers that I'd love to just very quickly introduce, and we'll get into the conversation. So we have Kemba Byam, who's the manager of Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit with the City of Toronto. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Welcome. And Nation Cheong, who's the Vice President of Community Impact at the United Way Greater Toronto. Thank you so much, Nation, for joining us. So let's dive in here, and there are a number of emerging technologies that we could talk about. Ileana talked about blockchain and other kinds of things, but generative AI tools are perhaps the most prevalent and the fastest growing of these technologies. So I'll start with a sort of an overall question, because it feels like we're very much at the sort of the early stages of using Gen AI tools in workplaces and in a more comprehensive sort of way. And it feels in some ways like this is the early 1990s or mid 1990s where the internet was just beginning to go mainstream, right? And there were people, in the nonprofit and charitable sector, there were folks in community organizations back then who were debating, what are we going to use the internet for? How can the internet really, I don't see how we can make services better with the internet, right? And so, but now it feels like we're in a very similar place where there is this conversation and discussion about, can we actually make services better with AI? And so from a funder's perspective, sitting where you are, how would you characterize this AI era we're in? And maybe Nation, will start with you and go to Kemba.
I'll start with 2 points that I hope will set the tone for the conversation. To your point, when I entered social services back in 1997, my entry point into an organization that still exists called Dixon Hall in the downtown east, which serves Regent Park, Cabbagetown, and to a certain degree Moss Park. I spent 9 years at that organization. And I walked in there to volunteer, and 2 doors opened for me. One was to paint 9 banners for a downtown service partnership called Growing Up Healthy Downtown, and it was around early childhood year development and coaching for parents, etc. The second was to introduce aging seniors and the homeless population to email, and everyone was like, "What? Like, just the kids are on Messenger and all that. Why do seniors need to be on the internet, and why homeless folks would want to be on the internet?" And that was my entry point into this sector almost 30 years ago. So there's some truth to what you're saying, and I think that it sets the context to say that the not-for-profit sector is usually not at the cusp of advancing technologies. Technologies are often driven, this is Nation's point of view, either by military need or market need. The not-for-profit sector is often dealing with the outcomes of those needs at a societal basis. So I would say, at best, the not-for-profit sector, generally speaking, is maybe in the explorer. I think it's grasping because the sector prides itself on ethics, prides itself on its moral compass because of the focus of those who are most marginalized, those who have been left out of the capitalist promise, the promise of the utopian democracy those whose dignity is compromised in the very streets of industry at the corner of Bay and King Street. And so there's a mindset tension point between how technology is understood and the values and identity of the not-for-profit sector. So I think that's part of the transformation that's necessary, is to get to a place of understanding first and foremost, and the attitudinal shift necessary to see technology as an enabler, and to be engaged in the discourse, read and build knowledge to understand how are people dealing with some of the most complex ethical issues. Because it's easy to just draw a camp and say, this is good, that is bad. And I think Ileana's early comments is, what is at risk is you'll get left behind. Because it's happening. There's no choice, period. So you choose how to engage, or you're making a choice for your organization and perhaps your contribution to the mission to be obsolete.
Right. And can I just a quick follow-up? Winding the clocks back to 1997, very quickly, how did you convince folks to, jump on email?
It was easier to convince the seniors population because the idea of connectivity, the idea of this new tool at your disposal to reach back to your family and friends across the world.
Instantly. Right.
That was it. People didn't need any more convincing than that. There's no threat. You can craft your own emails. Let me help you with this. And of course, there's a bit of a learning curve, right? Where's that @ sign? What is it? But once people get it, they're like, okay, now the sense of a whole new world opening up is really inviting for folks.
Super. Thank you so much. Kemba.
Yeah, I want to agree with all that Nation has said. And, governments, too, have not been at the forefront of artificial intelligence. And, because to be at the forefront, you have to be an early adopter. And in order to be an early adopter, you have to be agile. But governments have to really guard against what are the harms or the potential harms of artificial intelligence, whether perceived or not. Right? So we're in an area where, at least for the division that I work for, where we are doing human services work. We are dealing with Indigenous communities. We are dealing with Black, other racialized communities, those living with access needs through ability, those who represent diverse gender communities, right? And there have been real ways in which they have been harmed by AI, predictive policing. We look at facial recognition, right? How those have impacted Black folks, where we see the recognition diminishes based on gender and race. And then something as simple as, we saw, especially post George Floyd, the ways in which, different content creators who are Black and Indigenous were shadow banned and continue to be shadow banned, right? So there's a ways in which in the current landscape that governments have to partner with communities and not-for-profits and private organizations to move work forward, but at the same time has to regulate to prevent the harm to those communities and also educate in partnership with those communities about what the benefits are as well too.
Right. And just within the city of Toronto, how would you characterize the types of conversations happening along these lines? Because there is a number of government services that could use chatbots and things like that perhaps don't yet. But are there how are these conversations happening in the city?
Yeah, so privacy is a big thing, to be very honest with you. So even if I want to move anything forward where I want to advance anything in the city, I have to go through what's the privacy stuff around it. We also have meetings where, I don't remember what the name of it, but they have AI minute takers, right, with community. And there are some communities that are like, hey, this is really great, I can take minutes, I don't need to be here. And there are other community members who are like, this doesn't make me feel safe, right? So what we've had to do is we've had to be like, okay, unless there's consensus within the room about the use of AI tools, that we don't allow these things. So these are the things we're actually currently grappling with at the city about something as basic as AI minute takers, as both an accessibility need and also like how are you actually able to be present and give your ideas, right? So my experience with those minute takers is that there isn't anything being given back, so it's just taking information. How is the data that's being taken from those meetings being used by those technologies is, you know, one concern that I can talk about.
Super. Nation, are you seeing privacy as something that's come up a fair bit in the community services work that you're involved in?
Yeah, I would say long before the proliferation of this conversation about generative AI, data sharing has been an ongoing question within the not-for-profit sector. And you think about, for example, the ways in which some of the more vulnerable folks who many agencies serve interact with different systems, the healthcare system, the justice system, the social welfare system, the housing or shelter system. There are leaders in this sector that have been trying to tackle that question of how do you use data safely, respectfully, human-centered, mindful of the ethics and privacy, but maximize the access to that data to understand how are people interacting with systems. Where are the gaps? Where could we be more effective in the use of public dollars? Where could we be more effective in the use of philanthropic dollars? Are we building, do we have the knowledge and information to make strategic decisions to improve the infrastructure with the people at the center? You hear complaints from folks who are low income, working class folks, or folks who are trying to break out of the shelter system who's saying, why do I have to speak to 10 different people and explain the same things 20 times? My day's done. Right. And my dignity, by the time I'm at my second meeting, I feel like my dignity is I don't even want to have these conversations anymore because the person sitting in front of me is tired because they've had 10, 20 of me who they've had to speak to. So the impact on the human relations that is necessary to support people to navigate through what can be complex, sometimes inefficient systems, can be answered with better data and understanding how people move through the systems and more effective way to support them so that you're respectful of their time and efficient with information to help them to solve the issue that they're trying to solve for.
Right. Can I just jump in quickly? Because I think what's important is that oftentimes those folks who are in government doing that work have lived experience, right? And so in just locating that those folks are often Black, often working class too, having to hear those experiences mirrored back to them as well is exhausting. So what is our responsibility in educating and supporting those staff members as well, and how AI will benefit them as well as the clients, but also thinking about I know that Eliana talked about, technology being agnostic, but we know that there is always human oversight that imbues bias. So, like, how do we make sure that we arm government employees and how to remove that bias as much as possible while reaping the benefits?
Right, and I want to pick up on that point exactly because, for many decades, data collection and surveys and all this, it's been done so much, and a number, particularly Black and racialized communities, there's this view that a lot of this is just extractive. Who has a say in where this goes? Who has a say in how the data is being used? How like we'll start with you, Kemba. Like how can municipalities and particularly sort of service providers can navigate these types of questions?
Yeah. So currently at the City of Toronto, we're actually working on a Black data governance framework, and that was done in partnership with that is being done, I should say, with the Wellesley Institute and Black Health Alliance. So we're looking at, how do we ensure that we partner with organizations, get consultations on how we do this the right way, right? Co-design, collaboration, but also there are opportunities for us to look at other municipalities to see what they're doing. Maybe not in Canada, because I'm not sure that the landscape is great in terms of doing anti-Black racism work across Canada, but like, how do we look at other regions like the US, like other African states who may be doing this work, maybe in a different way that we can bring back and bring to us?
What did you mean by the landscape isn't great in Canada? Can you
I would say, I would say that, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit began in 2018 after the Toronto Action Plan to Confront Anti-Black Racism was formed by City Council. This was based on advocacy on organizations, Black Lives Matter, right? And we, not to be egocentric, but like we were really the leader in doing anti-Black racism work before the murder of George Floyd, right? And so when we look at anti-Black racism work across the country, it's slow, it's not necessarily diverse, and we're getting there, I'll say that, but I would say the landscape is such that Black folks in 2024, despite what has happened since the murder of George Floyd, still feel and are impoverished in terms of political rights, social rights, health rights, and that's important to know and be very clear about.
Can I pick up a bit on that?
Ahead.
So I think the question of ownership of data is really critical, and I think there's lots to learn from First Nations, Canada's First Peoples, who have an articulated value around data sovereignty and data ownership. And I think that many communities, Black and other racialized communities, can learn from that in the ways in which it's made public their expectations around data. I think the City of Toronto is doing some incredible work. The partnership that we've had for many, many years is bringing us to another opportunity called the Toronto Neighborhood Assessment Framework. And it's in a framework that's starting to look at what are the equity indicators at a neighborhood level, but goes beyond the quantitative and starts to get into the qualitative, the voice of the residents. So part of what we have to answer is like, how do residents access that data? How do local community service agencies who have helped to inform and build this have access to that data? So I think that there's a values element there of ensuring that the community has access to the data and can use that data. Again, always respecting the laws around privacy. I want to lift it up a little bit and just posit that I think everything that, at least I'm saying, and I think it maybe goes true for Kemba, is that there's an exceptions, or I would argue that our social values, our attitudes, and our behaviors are at a place, albeit awakened by George Floyd, unmarked graves, et cetera, in a way in which we have to be very, very careful, because technology is an accelerator. And if our social values are not at the level of practice, not rhetoric, at the level of practice, through policy and the way in which our institutions act, if our social values are not at that level of equity, fairness, and justice, then the risk is that technology accelerates those social values. It amplifies those social values. And I think that's at its very core in the comments around the earlier comments by Eliana. You have the user, you have the builder, and then you have the societal-wide impacts. If the builders are not bringing the emotional, experiential, principle and values-based points of view to how they are programming technology, then that technology is only going to replicate the values of the status quo. And so it becomes imperative, not only of who gets to own the data, but who gets to shape how that data is understood, interpreted, and puts out output to whatever user. That takes into consideration historical biases of who deserves, who doesn't deserve, who is a criminal, who is not a criminal, who is seen as the ideal newcomer or immigrant into a country, who is not seen as that. All of those things we are still wrestling with as flesh and bone human beings. And so it's presumptuous of us to assume that if we don't slow down and take the time to ensure that we have the voices that will challenge, I'm not sure that that's how that data point should be interpreted or understood, that we're not replicating ourselves and our still evolving social values.
Right.
Can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think for all those reasons, we have to, I say we, as government, have to think about artificial intelligence as a human rights issue, right? And look at how we are safeguarding against and implementing, socializing, and having representation that takes into consideration how are the human rights of those who are most impacted by AI negatively, how they're impacted, and how we move forward.
That's a really, I want to sort of dig into that a little bit because really compelling point around looking at AI as a human rights issue. I want to just pick up, Nation, on what you said, because at the core of it, it really feels like, just picking up from what Ileana was saying earlier this morning, that, you know, how can we apply, you know, principles of innovation and principles of equity and justice at the same time, right? Whether we're designing products or programs or services, because I think this is sort of like that disconnect of what if, and it is happening. You know, it's been happening for some time when innovation outpaces, you know, innovation outpaces justice, innovation outpaces equity, right? And so. Are you seeing within the sort of whether it's in United Way here in Toronto or across the United Way network, are you seeing instances of, you know, data sovereignty in different ways, you know, new frameworks for data sovereignty being discussed, or are you seeing that within the United Way network? Could you talk about that?
I can speak to it more concretely locally.
Yeah.
Certainly, we are a network across the country. And each United Way from one province to the next is an independent United Way. We come together on a regular basis to share what is happening in our local communities. That's just to set the context. But absolutely, as we do more, so we have a reconciliation and equity action plan at United Way Greater Toronto. It's informed by a similar plan that was developed by United Way Worldwide, and we adapted that to the Canadian context in 2021. Since the development of that Reconciliation and Equity Action Plan and the implementation of the actions within that plan, one of the key things that we are holding ourselves accountable to as a KPI is 100% of our research and public policy work will reference the reconciliation equity context of the issue. So if it's housing insecurity, of course there's all the data about housing insecurity, the lack of deeply affordable housing, et cetera, but it will also set the context of who is most specifically impacted by this, where do these folks live? Again, that's context to say the following. The more that we're doing this work, the more that we are reminded about data sovereignty, particularly from an Indigenous lens. So that's where it's most prominent is Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think the work that's happening at the City of Toronto is very, very promising as they're starting to look at data through the Black community lens. And of course, Black is not a monolithic community, it's multidimensional. So I think these are promising developments we're seeing in the funding space through municipal government, but also in the philanthropic space.
Super. Kemba, I want to dive into the point that you made about AI it really needs to be looked at as a human rights issue, because I sort of think about that and reflect on that a little bit, and I wonder, and I want to pose the question to you, is if we take that lens, how does that shift anti-racism work?
Well, it would necessitate that we bring in, first of all, we would look at it from a legal standpoint, that we have to provide protections for various racialized communities, various communities who've been targeted, but also that we have to use this model where those communities are brought in not just in the co-design, but to vet other actors and processes that may impact them, and also look at how AI looks at their well-being and inclusion, and ultimately what it looks like through the whole life cycle of the AI process and what it looks like generations down the road, right? So how is it benefiting, how is AI benefiting and also negatively impacting racialized folks, Black folks, those who are oppressed in terms of their ability to live a good life?
Go ahead.
May I build on that? If we think of the assertion that housing is a human right, let's just say we accept that housing is a human right.
Right.
I think when we think about AI through a human rights lens, and you think about systems that will be influenced by AI that can make decisions on who has access to housing and who doesn't, let's just say our current system is driven by people. Many would argue exhausted people because the challenge is so enormous. Let's just say AI is this powerful tool that could lift 70% of the administrative burden off people's shoulders. I accept that that is true. If that AI is just adapting the mindset, attitudes, and decisions that have taken precedence in the existing system, it continues to reinforce the barriers and the biases that decides who gets housing and who doesn't get housing. So that's, to me, is a clear example. The bigger picture from a socioeconomic lens that I think warrants a lot of thought and consideration is the fact that AI, to Ileana's point, and it's everywhere, is going to shift the social economic reality in 10 years. The economy is going to be a different economy in 10 years. What are the implications for those who are left out of the economy?
Right.
If you don't have the resources, financial, relational, educational resources to catch the tail end of this comment that's moving super fast, as we say back home, crapo smoke your pipe. You're going to get left behind. So what are the implications for that from a human rights perspective if we say housing is a human right? If the economy is now accelerated 20-fold, and AI is just emerging, look at the housing situation in Toronto right now. There may be, as I say this, folks in the room said, well, AI could perhaps help to solve that. Maybe, I just haven't seen it yet. Mm-hmm. I'm open to it, bring it on. I'm happy to participate in that conversation. I just have not seen it yet. But if AI is market-driven predominantly, and AI is now being used to figure out an algorithm of how I can charge the most rent and predict the marketplace, we have a human rights issue on our hand if we believe housing is a human right.
Right.
So that's just one very clear example of where technology can be maximized based on values, practices, attitudes, and behaviors that have historically left others out.
Yeah.
And governments have a responsibility to make sure that they are partnering with organizations to understand that that's where the future is going.
Right.
And how do we make sure that community members are able to understand that's where they're going, and that's why they need to catch up. And some of the, not only to prevent the bias that is involved in AI, but to educate folks that there is an intentional move towards removing bias, and that they should, I guess, get on the boat, if you will, to acclimatize themselves to the use of AI tools.
Right. And, let's actually get into that, because what's the responsibility of funders? Whether it's a government funder or, a philanthropic funder or other types of funders, what's the responsibility of funders here? Because, Nation, you brought up this point around, is this an effective use of dollars, whether it's public dollars or philanthropic dollars? And Ileana had a stat about, I think it was about, like 40 hours a month, is lost, due to ineffectiveness that AI could potentially help with. So let's, would love to explore what is the responsibility of funders, if the sort of the lens that that we take for now, at least, is this an effective use of dollars? What's one way that AI could actually help funders, better support underserved communities? Nation, we'll start with you.
So I'll start by saying that the philanthropic sector, the not-for-profit sector, values are about civil society and the betterment of communities, generally speaking. But it is not immune to the same biases, prejudice, historical racism. It doesn't have a magic carte blanche, immunity to that. So I think with that, in that regard, the first responsibility, I would say, in the philanthropic sector and funders is to take a learning stance. That's the number one responsibility, is to step into the learning moment and understand what are the implications of AI, first and foremost. From a planning and strategy perspective, I see great value in AI being used very well. If I could free up 20% of my staff's time from the monotony of administrative work,
right,
through a chatbot that helps to answer mundane questions that 10 organizations ask all the time, that's a good use of time. That's a good use of technology that allow my colleagues to focus on strategic work, to focus on relationship building, to focus on the other aspects of the world or of the work that we don't want to relegate to technology. If my colleagues can save 2 days' work creating a presentation using AI for a panel conversation, etc., absolutely. It's about how do we use those technologies to be more effective in our work and to maximize philanthropic dollars, which can't compete with government dollars,
right,
but can be used to the greater point of efficacy. So that's one.
right.
The bigger picture is how we can use AI to gather, consolidate, synthesize, and analyze data that help us to understand where are the greatest needs across the GTA. If we anticipate 3 more million people in the GTA by 2035, if we go from 6 million to 9 million,
right,
current general estimates, based on trends, based on current trends of homelessness, mental health issues, gender-based violence, seniors isolation, youth unemployment, how can AI put us in a predictive stance to help us to plan, strategize, coordinate with governments, coordinate with private sector to say, how do we build better communities together? If the technology can help us do that, then I think, and I believe there are opportunities to do that, then I think that's an effective way in which the philanthropic sector can utilize technology for greater community planning through the lens of equity, reconciliation, justice, etc. But it requires the sector to see itself as an active actor, an important actor in the development of the technology and not a passive victim of technology. That's the problem right now. It becomes this David versus Goliath mindset, and that is not going to help anyone. We're in that description falling back on a binary that puts us out of the conversation to A, influence,
Right.
or A, understand, and B, influence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to kind of come into sort of the active shaping and building of the technology itself, but I want to dig into it a little bit because, you know, if this is a responsibility of funders, whether government or philanthropic or other kinds of funders, to you know, support underserved communities well, and you know, you're saying, you know, AI literacy is going to be an important part of that. How do we get ahead here? Because like where would pressure come from for funders to prioritize AI literacy, take this learning stance as you called it? Where can pressure come from to enable them to? Is it donors? Is it other stakeholders? Is it you know, where would pressure come from for them to adopt this learning stance and prioritize AI literacy?
As a sector, as a philanthropic sector, I think that pressure comes from multiple places. I think it's our ability to stay in pace with how society is changing, and so we have this thing, folks might have heard of, like often do a pieced analysis. What's the political, economic, social, technological context of the situation right now? So technology tells us here is how technology is changing, exacerbating, maintaining the conditions that are contributing to the phenomena that we are trying to address. So that's just built into the ethos of the sector.
Has the sector done a piece analysis on AI?
Like I said, I think we're in a learning stance right now.
Okay.
There might be organizations who are more advanced in their learning. I think from a United Way standpoint, I can speak very specifically.
Sure.
We're in a learning stance right now. So at our senior team, should we get a policy? Should we have an AI policy?
Right.
And rightfully, I think, folks are like, it's moving too fast. By the time we write that policy, it's out of date.
Right.
We have to be in a learning, we have to catch up on the learning. We have to build the capacity within our teams to understand who is most likely to be impacted by AI technology. Is it the finance business management team? Is it the fundraising team? Let's get on top of that and create a learning environment so that folks are in a learning stance and adapting. That is how the culture will change. So that's where we're at as an organization. And attending conferences like these to learn and understand what we've never seen ourselves as a technology sector.
Right.
But the intersection of these two worlds is unavoidable at this point in time. So that's why it's requisite for us to take this learning stance.
Right.
I think in terms of government, it has to be about civic engagement. How our communities, how our organizations, going to councillors, going to the mayor, going to ministers and saying, we need you to represent this well for us. We need you to not only educate us, but bring us to the table on how we could advance this so that our communities don't get left behind. And thinking about how does AI support funders like in the government, just thinking about my division in particular, we know that the communities that we serve have been underfunded or unfunded for a long time. And so what this means is that there's not a lot of money, but the need is still great. Right. So how do we use AI to allow folks to apply in ways that are low barrier, and ways that our staff can go through those applications in ways that are effective and fast, because that's one of the complaints, how come it took us so long to get this approval, but also look at where is the need for funding, how can we advocate with City Council that maybe this particular funding is $2 million, but it actually needs to be $5 million because we've had this many applications for all these great needs.
Right. Yeah. just to take that a bit further and dive into what does it look like for funders to help shape and build, because we're here in Toronto, and not too far from here, there's all kinds of AI institutes. Like just Vector AI Institute is not far from here at the Mars Discovery District. And one of the things I've noticed is when you look at the list of partners, you go on Vector AI's website and you look at the list of partners, and there's all kinds of corporate partners, right? Big companies, medium-sized companies, multinationals, etc. I don't really see philanthropic partners there. I don't really see funders as partners. I don't really see not-for-profits, charities as partners. It's institutes like Vector across the country that are building and shaping and developing policy and all of these kinds of things. What does it look like for us to be a part, for funders, for not-for-profits, community service organizations to be a part of this shaping? Let's want us to explore this a little bit, because if we're not part of this shaping, then it's always going to be, as you both have said, very much a David and Goliath type of play, a catching up, a critique. It's always going to be that. It's insufficient, it's inadequate, it's not inclusive. These are the sort of the stances. And so, what does it look like? We look at just the fastest growing AI company in the world, OpenAI, and like explosive growth, but built on a language model that is very Western centric, very white centric. And so there's now conversations about what does an indigenous OpenAI look like, as an example. Right, very different set of ways to even learn, because like the model would have to learn from oral wisdom and oral knowledge and so on. So giving that as a small example, but what does it look like to partner with these types of institutes or not? But I look at that and I kind of go, well, where are funders? Where are the philanthropic funders? Where is the not-for-profit sector? Right?
Vision. I think it starts with vision. If you want to show up in the room and not be the passive consumer of information or absorber of information, you have to have vision. You have to have a sense of direction of what you think is possible. What do we think is possible as a philanthropic sector, as a not-for-profit sector? And I don't know that we have enough of those tables to generate that conversation yet. Because otherwise, and there's an interesting parallel here, otherwise you show up in the room the way in which we're inviting community into our spaces. You don't know the language. You don't know the subtleties, the acronyms, and right. So you're just at the table trying to catch up. What's great about our sector is we have a value that is inclusive and says we have to create the right spaces for community to participate and be part of real community building. This is community building at a whole other level, and in order for the philanthropic world to show up, I think there's a mindset shift, there's a culture shift, and there's a need for vision. There's a real need for, like the vision of an indigenous-centric AI. What that could mean, I have no idea. But sometimes the value of being marginalized is you have the space to determine what is our vision for us without, because we're on the outside, we don't need the pressure of. And then you show up with that clarity of vision and you can genuinely shape the narrative, right? Because you recognize the value of the sector for broader society and you're able to defend that concretely through social economic terms. And the therefore this is what we would like to see AI do for the not-for-profit civil society sector, and how it contributes to the vibrancy, the health, the wellness, the sustainability of our social values and our economy.
All right.
We have a lot of questions in the audience. We'd
Okay.
love to go there.
Terrific. Yeah. we
Can I
will.
just say
Yeah,
one
sure. Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
I think in tandem with that, it requires courage and
Yes.
willingness, and governments are risk averse. So that means we need time. So it's kind of,
Which we don't have.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. A good segue, and it sounds like there's lots of questions.
Yes.
So let's. I think there's there's a question
questions?
right here. Just,
Voilà.
yeah, we can
Gardez les
start there.
questions brèves, s'il vous plaît.
Ma question sera brève. Je vais commencer. Je suis confuse. Hein. C'est un malaise que je sens. Ça n'a rien à voir avec les panélistes. C'est plutôt, je me sens comme si c'était dans une conférence, n'importe où dans le monde. On parle des communautés minoritaires, mais on ne nomme pas nécessairement la communauté francophone noire. En tout cas, moi, je sens que les sujets qui sont apportés font écho sur tout le monde, mais la réalité noire, francophone, Toronto, ontarienne, je ne l'entends pas dans les discussions, ce n'est pas beaucoup ressorti. C'est juste le malaise que je sens, je vais nommer. Question maintenant. On parle des données. Je sais que Centraide fonctionne beaucoup avec les données de la réalité des communautés et ainsi de suite. La ville de Toronto, c'est la même chose. Alors, étant donné que les informations, vous faites des recherches justement pour voir l'impact des enjeux sociaux sur des populations. Très peu souvent, on a des données sur les francophones de Toronto. Et la conception des programmes, le développement des programmes ou le financement des programmes ne tient pas nécessairement compte de la réalité des francophones de Toronto ou des noirs francophones de Toronto. Comment l'intelligence artificielle pourrait aider vos deux organisations à mieux comprendre la réalité des noirs francophones à Toronto et les soutenir dans l'effort d'aider les francophones?
I just want to say, I don't know that the government does a lot of research. I think there are ways in which there are opportunities for us to partner and support, academic institutions to do that work. And I agree with you. There's a lot of growth that needs to be done in terms of Black Francophone communities and how we use AI. I'm not quite clear about. Within the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, has been doing a lot of work with La Passerelle. Even today, one of my staff is presenting at the Toronto Francophone Affairs Committee. So the work is being started, and I think it's important, like Nation was saying, we too are in the learning stage. It's important for Black Francophone community members to come to us and say, this is what's important to us. We did community consultations through La Passerelle for the next 10-year action plan to confront anti-Black racism. And also, like, here is how artificial intelligence can be used to better support Black Francophone communities. And also, here are the things to safeguard against, because we understand the racism that happens for Black Torontonians who speak French within Francophone communities as well, too. And also, sorry, last thing, one of the initiatives that we have is the Black Mandated Funding Framework. How are the ways in which we can continue to fund Black French-speaking organizations to do this work? Because we are not necessarily going to do the work. It's how we're going to fund other organizations to do the work as well.
You got it. Yeah, I will just add a little to that, but I think Kemba has answered really, really clearly. As an organization, as we've implemented our Reconciliation Equity Action Plan and set targets to increase funding for Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other racialized communities, having a relationship with the La Passerelle gives us the context of the Black Francophone community. And it is part of a growing understanding within organizations. I think certainly in United Way Greater Toronto and the City of Toronto are two demonstrable institutions that the Black community is not a monolithic community. And it's our responsibility in these institutions to set that context and to challenge that paradigm of an assumption that blackness is one swath, and we recognize that you can think about the black community in multiple dimensions, linguistically, in terms of spiritual, religious practices, in terms of sexual orientation. All of these are, this common word, are intersecting identities. And so when we think about AI, and again, I preface by saying we are not AI experts by any means. Yes. We are learning. So please take this with a grain of salt. As we become more knowledgeable about AI and we think about how AI can help us to deeply analyze data in complex ways and understand that intersection, if we build in values and now I'm just pretending like I know what I'm talking about. No, not the values part. I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to values. I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to values. But I tried to pretend I was a programmer for 30 seconds. Like, don't, they're going to see right through you. You are not a programmer. But all to say, for those, I don't mean to abuse for any programmers or tech experts in the room. I don't mean to abuse the language. But to be able to build in the right protocols within the technology that values intersectionality. That's what I'm talking about, that we have to have the right builders. To your question about how what else funders can do, so I spoke to it specifically from a United Way perspective. Research and knowledge mobilization is an important tool we have as an organization, and so as we publish papers, especially when we think about inclusive economic opportunities, the proliferation of AI and the impact on the economy and the risk of further marginalizing communities has to be a part of that narrative. The degree to which we can ensure that the narrative that we craft around this takes a nuanced approach, or at minimum acknowledges that further research is required to understand the specific experience of the Black Francophone community versus A, B, C, or D. So I think that's a responsibility on our part as an organization. And as I see more not-for-profit organizations emerging from the Black Francophone community, that becomes another aspect for us to understand where are those assets needed across the GTA. Because that's how we have to think. We have to think about where do we maximize our investment to meet need. Which means we say yes to some things and no to other things.
Can I just say very quickly, I said this before, civic engagement by the Black Francophone communities is so important. So pushing up against your council, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Advocating.
Having a meeting and advocating.
Advocating. With your city councilor, with those political bodies in your neighborhood is so important. We know this as Black communities. That's how we have seen change, when we have mobilized and really built relationships with politicians to see those who don't necessarily see it because of their experience, but what is the motivation for them to support Toronto's Black Francophone communities, because we know that you all are here in number. One day I hope to be included. I'll be bilingual and I'll be having this whole conversation with you in French, but that is really the key.
Super. Thank you.
Ouais, je vais poser ma question en français. Je sais, le mot-clé qui a retenu mon attention, c'est l'intersectionnalité. Puis la question pour vous, c'est comment vous expliquez que au niveau de l'intersectionnalité, il y a de l'intersectionnalité également pour les communautés francophones ou pour toute autre communauté, pas seulement la communauté francophone noire. Alors, est-ce que vous pensez que la question du data, parce qu'il a parlé de la souveraineté au niveau des data, est-ce que c'est ça qui ferait la différence pour la communauté francophone noire de l'Ontario? La souveraineté de data, comme pour les autochtones.
I'll say, so the question, okay, everybody else got headphones, that's good, I'm explaining. I'll start by saying that the work of Canada's First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, I think is a stellar example, because they have a solid stance, history, relationship around treaty rights and a history of expectations, advocacy for sovereignty broadly. And so this context, this question of data sovereignty, I think, is very, very specific to Indigenous communities, based on that history with Canada. Your question was around, is the answer for the Black Francophone community around data sovereignty? I think I need to understand, like, what is the big question? Data sovereignty to what ends? So maybe yes, but to what end? I think if it's if you could help me to understand,
Yes.
to what end would be helpful.
Au fait, ma question c'est comment faire comment est-ce qu'on peut rendre au niveau de l'intelligence artificielle les informations sur la communauté francophone accessibles au niveau de l'intelligence artificielle pour permettre que les spécificités de cette communauté soient rendues dans l'intelligence artificielle, comme pour toute autre communauté où on retrouve l'intersectionnalité dont vous parlez, que ce soit la communauté LGBTQ, de LGBTQIA+, ou la communauté autochtone, ou la communauté, n'importe quel être humain au niveau de l'intersectionnalité. Donc, je voudrais savoir qu'est-ce qui peut être fait pour la communauté francophone noire en Ontario au niveau de l'IA. Merci.
I think at minimum, it's ensuring that we have two things. One, existing data sets around the Black Francophone community in any tool that United Way Greater Toronto would create, especially if that tool helps us to make strategic decisions, so that we're factoring in the context of the Black Francophone community. And the second is, because the technology is evolving so quickly, and as I have asserted earlier, we're in a learning stance, is to ensure that any platforms that are created, any spaces that are created for us to test, affirm what data sets we're using to make strategic decisions, how we should be interpreting those data sets, should have representatives of the community at the table to bring that point of view into any decision making. As we create tools, A, we utilize the tools, B, and then whatever those tools output, that we're vetting it with the community, that is this correct? Would you validate that this is your point of view as a Black Francophone individual?
If I could just add, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit uses the principle of targeted universalism, so that when we, do work on behalf of those most marginalized, it's going to benefit other groups. So when we have input and data from, French-speaking Black Toronto residents, that is going to not only benefit the greater whole of Black communities in Toronto, but it's going to also benefit other marginalized groups. So if we look at this in the context of artificial intelligence, when we focus in on Black communities, when we focus in on Black Francophones, we can say, okay, some of this work that's come out of this is generalizable, and we can use it to benefit other intersecting communities as well, too.
Bonjour, mon nom est Joe Tamko pour Stop Racisme Canada. En fait, comme on le sait, les bailleurs de fonds en fait n'ont pas des fonds illimités, malheureusement. Et ce qui se passe, c'est qu'avec l'intelligence artificielle, les organismes peuvent en fait utiliser l'intelligence artificielle pour justement mettre en place des projets. Et dans mon cas, en fait, des fois, je travaille pour des clients et je peux faire 4 demandes par semaine. Et il y a en fait donc des bailleurs de fonds qui commencent à se plaindre d'avoir en fait trop d'organismes qui sollicitent justement l'aide de leur aide financièrement. Donc je voulais savoir, vous, quel est votre positionnement par rapport en fait à des organismes qui utiliseraient en fait l'intelligence artificielle pour mettre en place des projets, étant donné qu'il y aura un volume, je pense que si tous les organismes l'utilisent, dans le futur, il y aurait un volume plus élevé en fait de propositions. Donc je voulais savoir c'est quoi votre positionnement par rapport à ça, si c'est quelque chose qui pour vous ne serait pas bien à utiliser, s'il y aurait peut-être des pénalités au niveau des demandes, des choses comme ça, quoi. Merci.
Yes. So I encourage folks to look up an organization called Reimagine Labs. And they have actually developed an AI tool to help not-for-profits, primarily Black and other racialized not-for-profits who are not familiar with the funding ecosystem, to walk through concept to a logic model, all via AI. I've got an idea, and it walks you through all of the questions. Like, how do you know this is a real problem? What is the data that you're using? Who are all the funders that are interested in this? It walks you from A to B right now. We help to fund that. That's a resource that...
Right. Reimagine.
Reimagine Labs.
Okay.
So to your question though, what are the implications of this? The implications are huge. Because the intent is to level the playing field, right? Because historically, folks who are well-versed in grant writing and have the relationships, they know what funders are looking for, they know how to shape, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my understanding of this AI tool, we just got a sneak peek of it, is that it not only it's centered around not-for-profit social issues. It's built around folks who have ideas and visions for how to address social issues. It looks at administrative data, StatsCan data. It looks at local data to the point at which that data is accessible. It also looks at what have funders historically funded in these particular areas. The value of that, I think, at minimum, is it does level a playing field and creates greater access. The challenges are, it's easy now to just replicate and cookie cutter, and now you have a plethora of submissions coming in that are kind of all starting to look pretty much the same, right? So what it means for us as an organization are at minimum twofold in my mind. One is, how do we use AI to sort through all of that, and then to be able to, at best, separate the wheat from the chaff, as to use an old saying, so that what's landing on my colleague's desk, who have to sit and read and go through this, we feel relatively confident are unique applications that meet our criteria and saves them the like that could be weeks of work, and we don't always have the luxury of weeks of work. It also pushes us to be very solid on our criteria and the rubric for our decision making. Because when everything starts to look at the same, how do you distinguish? And I think AI can play a significant role in that, but I would never want to remove the human element of reading through, because the people who are reading through this, they know the sector. They have the relationships. Do we have to expand those relationships to more Black Francophone communities? Yes, I think that's a fair argument. But there's an intelligence there that I think is essential to any AI tool. that I would count on for anything that comes on my desk if I have to sign off on final decisions. I would not want to, I don't feel as a funder and someone who makes decisions on resources going out that we're in a position to make any decisions solely based on AI. We're far from that at this. We may need to catch up and be there in 5 years, maybe, but at this point I would say I rely on my colleagues' intelligence and relationships with community far more than I would any technology at this point in time. But I know that a rebalance is coming. There's no escaping it. And so that's why for us, taking a learning stance is incredibly important.
Yeah, can you just as a quick follow-up, do you accept applications, or would you accept applications that are written by AI, and if so, do folks need to declare that they're written by AI?
I think any application we would want to reference, like, where are the sources. So I don't know that we have the capacity to understand what is written by AI and what is not yet. We're not there.
Right.
We're not even there right now. So there it is. So, right. So this is an example of us catching up really quick, needing to catch up really quickly. How do we use AI to say, help us to analyze these 400 applications, discern for us what is clearly 100% written by AI, what is enhanced by AI, and what is non-AI altogether. And we may say 100% written by AI. We're not reading that right now. Enhanced by AI, I see value in any document being enhanced by AI. If it's generated by work that's been done in the community, by real gathering of intel and community engagement, and AI is just helping you to articulate that in a more clear, succinct way, all good. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it looks like this content seems to be borrowed from an application that was written 20 years ago, no thank you. We want to get rid of that.
And I think there's a way in which talking about, the subject matter experts, because the city, in our division, we've had, long-standing relationships with the organizations who would be applying for funding. So we would be able to read and be like, maybe this is
Leonie's voice.
But we also have to understand that because a lot of folks don't have the time and capacity, what's the reason why they're using AI? And then there's a time that we need to go back and meet with those applying to explain to them why they didn't receive the funding. So that takes time as well too, right? The education piece, the socialization piece.
Right, because a lot of it is also a function of how complicated the journey and the procedure is, going from, like your expression of interest, say, to, when the funding decision is made. And so how much energy can we spend writing expressions of interest?
That's right.
And through the Black mandated funding framework that I spoke about, and the hopefully upcoming Indigenous mandated funding framework, we're looking to reduce the barriers, the application barriers, so folks don't feel like they need to invest as much, and using AI tools, so that makes it inauthentic.
There's an important, I think this is worthwhile noting, so sorry, there's an important ethos around do no harm in this sector. And if you think about a well-intended, so let's go with the most optimistic, a well-intended group of folks, handful of folks who want to do something good in their community, but they don't know where to start. It can be easy to just say, well, what have other people done? Let's replicate that. Let's submit. Let's get some resources. And then we're going. And you enter into a service to your community with all of the confidence, good intention. Let me underscore that. Good intention. But lacking the requisite skills and experience to deliver. And you end up doing more harm. So that is the challenge. It's not just about, and it's such a brilliant question. It's not just about our ability to articulate a great idea and show a logic model and show like how we're going to measure outcomes. AI can do that in an instant. Show me a project plan for addressing domestic violence put that in, and it'll pump something out for you. I've tried it.
Right.
That's actually not the administrative burden on the funder is minimal to the danger to community.
Right.
Because good intentions
well said.
could lead to a lot of harm. And I'm taking the most optimistic point of view, that there are lots of people who want to do good, but they don't understand the complexity of the work. And then when they're in the work, who's dealing with someone with a significant trauma, just left their homeland, they're now landing here. Your heart says, I want to do good. I need resources to do that. Let's get an application. Let's go and reimagine. Let's put something in there and see if United Way or Trillium or the city of Toronto is going to give us money.
Right.
And now you got people who are making the work harder on the ground for the people who are actually, who have the expertise, who are trained professionals in trauma-informed care. So the risk is that the appearance of expertise via AI can translate good intentions to harm, and we have to be very, very mindful of that.
Yeah, so important nuance there. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Oui. Rapidement, j'ai rapidement une question. C'est trop intéressant. Merci beaucoup pour cette conversation parce que on se pose tellement de questions sur la question des nouvelles technologies. Une des questions que j'ai deux rapidement. La première, c'est de savoir si le Reimagine Lab a une version, peut développer vraiment un secteur francophone. Je connais que Liban, qui est le fondateur, que je connais très bien, et très axé sur les communautés anglophones, et fait un travail exceptionnel. Est-ce qu'il y a moyen, par exemple, de développer une collaboration étroite avec eux pour vraiment impliquer le secteur francophone? La deuxième chose, c'est beaucoup plus aussi un commentaire. J'adore les perspectives de ce matin parce que ça apporte une autre lentille. Depuis, on parle de ce que les nouvelles technologies peuvent faire, comment ça peut évoluer, mais la question de human rights et comme Nation disait tout à l'heure, le logement, c'est une question des droits fondamentaux, des houses, des human rights, le contexte des Premières Nations. Je pense qu'on doit continuer à ajouter, et dans ce processus, à vraiment mettre la lentille sur les questions d'équité, d'inclusion, et dans ce processus. Donc, vraiment, c'est plutôt un commentaire, et merci beaucoup d'être là ce matin.
I think there has to be a value and an understanding of how Francophone communities, Black Francophone communities have to be brought into these discussions and leading that. You know, at the City of Toronto, Leonie, you and I have had this conversation. It is an Anglophone corporation, right? So even just for me trying to advocate on what does it look like beyond just getting documents translated into French, how are we going to shift the culture in terms of, you know, making the needs and understandings of not just French-speaking people, but Black French-speaking people a priority. So that's a culture shift, and that goes back to what I was saying in terms of how are we ensuring that community members are advocating in different spaces, not just with city council members and the mayor, but how are their partnerships happening with staff as well too, to shift policy and to have folks at the table to advance this work. So that for me is like, it's a culture shift. Also, you know, cultures take a long time to shift. And us being the government, making sure that we are not just building relationships with La Passerelle, but other French-speaking organizations so that there is a groundswell of understanding about how bringing Black Francophones into the culture is important and needed and representative.
I'll start with vision. So I think that broadly, and I'll come to the specificity of the Black French community, I think broadly as Black Opportunities Fund, Federal Foundation for Black Canadians, Black North, of all these new funds have emerged, one of the key questions that I hear within the community is, what is the vision? What is the end goal of these resources that are now in the community? What do we want to be different in GTA in Canada 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And are we directing the resources in that direction? Or are we going to find ourselves less strategic, less coordinated, and dispersing the money to good projects, but not necessarily leading to a vision for the community? Now that's a broad swath, but I think the same the principle applies for the Black Francophone community. Whether it's Le Passerelle leading the charge or a combination of organizations, what is the vision for the Black Francophone community in the GTA? That's our scope. In the GTA over the next 10 years. We have 3 million people coming into the GTA. How many of those folks will be from Black Francophone communities? What are the implications of that population growth? How many of those folks will need trauma support? How many of those folks will be part of the LGBTQ2 community? Like, all of that data helps to shape policy. It helps to shape strategic funding decisions. That's good planning, ultimately. But United Way can't answer that question. The community has to answer that question. And you may say, well, we need the resources to answer that question. Well, that's where we might be able to help. We might be able to partner with the municipal government, with Trillium, to say, listen, the Black Francophone community wants to put out a 20-year plan for the Black Francophone community. Our key interest is those who will be impacted by poverty and low income. That's going to be our main interest. So that would be why we would come to the table. And I say that because I recognize, again, as we're trying to distinguish the Black Francophone community, I also recognize the Black Francophone community is diverse within itself, right? So that intersectionality is really critical for us, but our vested interest as an organization would be, what does this data tell us about those who are most likely going to be struggling as a result of poverty? So then that informs, to the earlier question, how do the data sets inform our work? It has to be led by the community. So who are the researchers, who are the leaders in the Black Francophone community that can lead a research project that results in a 10-year, 15-year action plan for the Black Francophone community? Because now you have a unified voice and tool to knock on the door of your local councillor, your local MPP, your local MP, and funders to say, this is the collective voice, generally speaking, of the Black Francophone community. This is where we see ourselves. These are the concerns we have, which are not exclusively different from other communities, but specific to the linguistic context of our community.
Just very quickly, I guess Teresa and Gida, I'm calling you guys very soon to discuss about this.
On a ajouté un petit peu de temps, donc on a 2 autres questions, peut-être 3 autres questions. On va les garder brèves, s'il vous plaît.
Je vais quand même poser ma question. Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour votre participation ici aujourd'hui. En tant qu'organisation communautaire réunie ici, on est très content d'avoir les bailleurs de fonds. Ce que je voulais dire, c'est que depuis qu'on a commencé à débattre de cette question aujourd'hui, il y a un point.
Can we turn up the volume? I'm just having problems hearing the translation. Is it just me? Oh, sorry. My bad. Sorry, I apologize.
Merci. Donc, je voulais dire qu'il y a un constat. C'est vrai que bien avant de venir ici, nous avions fait tout ce constat. Le constat est le suivant. Il y a un phénomène qui s'est invité dans notre vie, qu'on appelle l'intelligence artificielle. Et le constat qu'on fait, c'est que il y a un côté qui est avancé, donc ceux qui maîtrisent cette technologie-là et ceux qui l'utilisent, et ceux qui l'ont fabriqué. Et puis, une autre partie de la communauté qui est derrière. Et tout à l'heure, quand Nation a parlé, il disait qu'ils sont en train de faire une étude, mais une procédure, il a peur que, avant même qu'ils finissent, le processus sera très, très, très avancé. Donc, voilà un constat réel que nous faisons aussi de cette situation-là. Donc, moi, je pose la question la suivante. C'est vrai, il faut faire les données, parce que les données nourrissent la prise de décision, elles nourrissent les projets, comme vous avez dit. Mais je pense qu'il y a pendant que nous faisons cela, qu'est-ce qu'il est fait pour que, ne serait-ce que des organisations puissent être au pas, ou au moins suivre pour celles qui sont marginalisées comme les Noirs ou les francophones. Parce que pendant qu'on attend, il y a vraiment quelque chose qu'il faut faire. Je voudrais donner par exemple une idée. La diversité, inclusion et équité, c'est un processus qui définit souvent la définition des fonds pour donner aux communautés. Est-ce que le volet intelligence artificielle ne peut pas être un autre volet que vous pouvez mettre dans vos politiques pour pouvoir nous engager là-dessus, pour que nous commencions ou bien nous continuions à travailler effectivement là-dedans pour que nous ne soyons pas à la traîne. Parce que c'est un phénomène qui est très, 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 très en vitesse. Donc c'est ça ma question. Est-ce que vous avez dans vos procédures des possibilités pour nous dire ces fonds-ci, c'est pour particulièrement promouvoir l'avancée ou bien la promotion de l'AI au sein des communautés noires? Il me semble que pour ne pas être à la traîne, on peut envisager aussi les choses de cette façon-là. Donc, merci.
I think ultimately, and thank you for that, I think ultimately Black Francophone communities have to decide. I think it's not for us to decide, it's for Black Francophone communities have to decide, and, you know, how we as governments and the underfunding organizations decide how to share the proliferation of AI. In terms of what Nation was sharing about, you know, who are the researchers, who are the thought leaders, who are the young people that we're bringing forward to move this forward as well too. I think if I understood your question correctly, did you want to add anything, Nation?
Yeah. Thanks, friend. So let me start by something that we're just starting to think about, generally speaking, is we ran a pilot project with 211. Folks are familiar with 211? Yeah. So it's the call center for access to social services, the City of Toronto and Trillium, to understand how we could advance social identity data in the not-for-profit sector. And that is the collection utilization of social identity data. And why that was an important endeavor for us is based on a core belief that we can't take a cookie-cutter approach to community problems. We have to understand what works well for whom, under what conditions. The French as a language and a culture dictates a different nuance to the approach to a community solution, I would posit. We're in our third stage of that initiative, and again, because it's very complex for data privacy reasons, for culture, mindset reasons, where folks are very afraid to ask folks for, like, how would you identify, like, folks aren't quite comfortable with that yet, just at a cultural level. We're taking a very slow approach to this initiative. We are at a point now to think about, do we have enough information to begin to think about how we invest in improving the data capacity amongst some organizations that would meet a rubric of readiness, and then learn how do these organizations actually improve as a result of that data capacity. So I think that we're in a tension point between the accelerated technology and the need to pace ourselves, test and learn what works well under what conditions and what would we support. I think the world of the not-for-profit would benefit, and a lot has happened in the US in this regard, and I think we could probably look to some of the work that's come out of Stanford University of engaging the tech sector like Microsoft to say there's a significant social economic risk if the not-for-profit sector gets left behind, if the human service sector gets left behind.
Right.
Can you bring your resources to bear, monetary expertise, to help to accelerate and lift the floor in the not-for-profit sector? I would love to be part of that conference. Right? Because folks have already been doing this in the US. Philanthropy, I don't think is in a position to, it's in a position to contribute to, but won't solve the data technology problems for the not-for-profit sector. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. But we can continue with initiatives like the one I just described, learn from it, and decide where are there opportunities for us to scale that work, to bring the knowledge to governments and saying, we're seeing great progress in this regard, maybe think about how government funding can support some of this. That's our approach to the work, because we recognize we have to raise every penny each year. We're not a family foundation. We don't sit on wealth. We have to go and ask for that money every year. So we have to decide, how do we use that money most judiciously to meet immediate needs for people who are struggling, but also to invest in the structural systems change that's necessary in order to mitigate what's happening on the ground. So yes, philanthropy has a role is my short answer. Funders have a role. I think that bringing the tech sector into the conversation is going to help to accelerate any progress that is possible, because the funding sector won't do it on its own.
Right, super. Kemba Nation, thank you so much. This was such an insightful, enriching conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and I just want to thank you both for your presence and your energy and your insights and the knowledge that you shared. Thank you so much.
Test. It's okay.